So when should you ask the question, does my business need a rebrand? When's the best time for that?
I mean, obviously, this is a conversation that we have all the time. And if you're asking that question, or if you're coming to the stage where you think that that's the right question to be asking, then it probably is already the time for an appraisal of where you're at, right? Yeah. So the first thing we'd always talk about is understanding what the current situation is. And a rebrand absolutely is something that you shouldn't like jump into without doing the requisite research and background. So like understanding where your strengths and weaknesses are, understanding what's changed internally and externally. When we do the kind of the research and discovery phase of this type of, in this area, you absolutely need a broad breadth of opinions, whether they're internal, external, or rather internal and external. So making sure that you have a genuine level of insight and understanding that's going to give you the outcomes and the answers that you can rely on, and they're actually going to inform the process. But until you've done that review process and you have a better understanding of kind of where the brand's sitting now, what its perception is with your audiences.
I think that's really interesting as well, that perception. What are other people saying about your brand? Not how you feel internally as a business, but the people looking in.
Absolutely.
How do they view it?
Perception is more and more around how we understand value, right? It's in the eye of value. You talk about value in the eye of the beholder, and actually the perception of a brand is actually the reality of it, right? Whether or not it's what you think it should be, what other people think of your brand is basically where your brand sits. So understanding if that aligns with your strategy and your objectives is a good indicator of whether or not you need to kind of continue down that process and identifying whether or not rebranding is where you want to be. But even the term rebrand is banded around by us as much as
we've been guilty in the past. But one thing I like that we do here specifically is brand refresh. Yeah. So we keep a lot of that original heritage, but then we move that brand forward so it's still relevant and concise and it's speaking to the right people.
And I think in most scenarios, like the most common reasons that people come to us is the brand's out of date, it's no longer fit for purpose. We've moved on as a business, our audiences have moved on, they're no longer aligned with our ambition. And all of that, leads you to a point of a brand refresh or a revitalisation, if you like, rather than a rebrand.
I like that word as well. To revitalise it, because sometimes it is that. You're watering a plant's already growing. Yeah. It's just kind of helping that come to bloom.
If you go for a full rebrand, I mean, there's very few scenarios where actually we'd be saying, no, you need to throw the whole out and start again, new name, new logo completely from scratch. And really, that's only has there been some sort of horrific event? Has there been an M&A activity where like the brand is completely different? Has there been some sort of bad perceptions developed around the brand that you want to get rid of? Hermes, the delivery company, moving to Every was entirely around the fact that everybody hated Hermes, right? That just had a terrible reputation. So they wanted to rebrand into something that was much more of a people-focused business. And I think you can arguably say that didn't really work. And the reason I would say that was the case was because they didn't really think about how they were going to change perceptions. They just changed the logo and the brand and say, we're this new thing.
People think a logo is your brand and your identity system is your brand. But I think something else we do well here is kind of how do we vocalize that brand? What's our communication? What's that tone of voice? Yeah. How do we literally communicate?
To go back to Every's example, they, in my opinion, they didn't spend anywhere near enough time communicating from the ground up what the rebrand meant, right? So you can change your logo, you can change your colours, but from an audience perspective, it just looks like papering over the cracks if you're not communicating how the brand has fundamentally changed alongside it. If you don't look at, okay, well, everyone thinks that we're terrible at what we do, we're going to give it a new name, but we're not going to talk about how we've actually improved, then it kind of defeats the object of it, and people are suspicious. Clients will say, we want to do this, but our first question to them was why? Why do you want to do this, right? Yeah. And it comes down to, okay, well, we want to engage this audience with this message for this purpose, for this outcome. But too often or not, they don't really know who that audience is.
Yeah, I think that's such a valuable point. Interesting word, I think that sums up a lot of this whole conversation. Why? Yeah. What are we trying to achieve?
Virtually everything we do, you tie it back to the why, right? And it's a really valid approach that actually, if you don't understand why you're doing something, if you don't understand the purpose and the objective, then you're kind of on to hiding to nothing where you start.
I think as well, it gives a validity to what you're doing, and it brings a lot of kind of staff on board as well. If you can buy into a general theme, we all know what we're doing and for why. It gives us a bit of clarity of how we move forward together as a company. And I think people get on board with stuff like that when it is a little bit more kitchen sink, like, so we know exactly what we're doing and for why, rather than some fluff that sometimes, admittedly, we can get into talking about branding. It's a bit more, this is what we're doing, and that's why.
I think, like, just an expansion on kind of the audience side of things as well, like, you don't operate in a vacuum, right? So, and no brand does. So understanding what your operating environment is, what your competitors are doing, how your competitors are engaging with their audiences, where the similarities are, where the differences are, building up that kind of wider picture of where your business sits in the marketplace against your competitors, alongside your audiences. That all kind of feeds into that rich tapestry, if you like, for want of a better term.
Do you think some of that is just intrinsic, where it feels like it sits, or does some of that come from metrics?
There's absolutely kind of quantitative and qualitative aspects to that research process that are both really valid. I think we use data a lot more, and I was chatting to Wes about it earlier today, about the role that data can play in developing not just kind of campaign strategy and tactics, but actually brand strategy. And understanding how you can leverage that data to make really informed decisions across brand as well as campaigns and everything else. But yeah, it all kind of feeds into that rich soup.
Yeah, I think it's so right. It all comes together as one.
Yes.
Hopefully where we're going with it.
Yeah, I mean, when people talk about rebrands or clients talk about rebrands, what they're often talking about is how can we change our logo, right? How can we update our look and feel, which is obviously a really important part of it. But it is only one part of it, right? I would argue the more important is the rationale, is the why, and pulling all that together into something that when we hand that to the design team, they're given something that gives them the reason behind, okay, well, we want to go down this direction and we want to take this visual approach and we want to use these colours and these fonts and this type of imagery, because not just because we think it looks pretty, but actually because it aligns with our audience, our target audience. It aligns with or exceeds our competitors in the marketplace, whatever the rationale and justifications are. But if you don't have that insight and data to back that up, then really it's just, we think this is nice, and that doesn't cut it anymore.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we get into that situation of Rich thinks or Mike thinks, but again, it goes back to that kind of, who's the client and what do we do for them to make this work? So if we look at the most common scenarios, situations, the way it plays out, what does the brand refresh and that process look like?
The next stage is typically the fun part, right? The bit that clients have in mind when they come to us, and that's looking at the design and the look and feel, the visual identity of the brand, and where that can go. And that's always the exciting part.
Yeah.
But you can only do that part well if you've done all the previous parts, right? If you come to this with a blank sheet of paper and say, right, what logo design or what brand overarching look and feel do we want the brand to have, but that's not based on anything, then you're destined for failure. It has to be driven and informed by that previous steps of the process. And then, with all that agreed, to be honest, the bit that always gets overlooked and doesn't have enough time and effort is launch and communicating what the brand means. And to go back to the Every example, they came with a new logo and this is our new brand, but very little on actually what that meant and what the brand vision was and how that had changed from Hermes to Every. And it's exactly the same with every brand, that if you're going to come out with a bold new look and a new positioning or any iteration or variation of that, you need to tell people why it's relevant and why they should listen. Too often people just kind of drop it, brands just kind of drop an updated look and feel without that journey being communicated. So
playing devil's advocate, how do we go about that? So we build the identity system. Essentially, there's a new logo, there's a new look. How do you put it out there into the world?
I think it has to be invested in, right? Again, it depends on how big a shift you've gone, right? You can take a British Airways where you've gone from a slightly more angular ribbon to a curved one, and actually that doesn't require the same level of communication as something much more grand in scale like Hermes and Every, to use the same example. So depending on the level that it is at, really does dictate and kind of influence how much investment and time and energy needs to be spent in communicating it. But regardless, like, you'll have gone through this process for a reason, and it's really important that all of your audiences understand what the reasons were, why you've done it, and what the outcomes are. So that's from, it could be content pieces, it could be a creative campaign, it could be doing a load of press work, it could be blogs on your website, it could be 1,001 different things, and probably should be a mix of all of them, based on how many different audiences you're needing to speak to, what the messages are and how they need to be conveyed, the size of your market, everything else, and 1,001 things I can't mention.
But I suppose that brings about quite a key point to what we do here. So we work with quite a few international global brands, and we quite often tweak that for each audience. And I think that's a really key point, isn't it? That we are speaking specifically to a singular audience each time.
Yeah, I mean, geography is quite an easy one to do that with, right? So if you're doing things in certain different territories, then colours and fonts and different things obviously mean different things to different people. So that has to be kind of reflected in the outputs. But even like within a single country, you're probably going to be talking to different audiences around different products or services, and they all do need that level of nuance and kind of care to make sure that you're projecting what you want or communicating what you want to be communicated with that individual group. Whatever metric you're choosing, you just need to make sure that actually you're going to get an answer that means something rather than just a number that you haven't really been working.
Yeah, how does it actually relate to the world we live in?
Yeah, exactly. When it comes to kind of KPIs, like, every client has different metrics that they're either already tracking or want to be tracking. So working with them to kind of, okay, well, this is what we would recommend. How does this fit with what you're already doing? Actually, we want to look at, I don't know, NPS scores or social mentions or 101 other things that it could be.
What are some of the key aspects we need to keep in mind going through this process?
I'd say understanding your audience, right, is the most critical aspect of any of this process. Doesn't matter if you're Apple or Lloyd's of London.
I think that is definitely on top of that pyramid.
It's that vein that runs through every great brand, is actually a really well-considered understanding of who they are, what the brand is and what it stands for and represents, and who their audience is, and how those two things are aligned. If you don't have that understanding of your audience, you can't expect to meet them with their time, their place, their context, and create something that genuinely is meaningful for their lives, which ultimately is the goal of every brand.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. We're looking to change, aren't we? To kind of create change within someone's life. I know that can sound a bit kind of big in scope, but actually a lot of the products we help kind of showcase and demonstrate, or whatever you want to say, through marketing, actually, long story short, that is going to change and impact someone's life, business, or the way that they go about their day. Yeah. So it is really important we show them how that works in the most kind of concise and clear way, isn't it?
Yeah. You look at Amazon or Apple or any of those, there is no ambiguity about who they are or what they do, right? Amazon is everything quickly done well, right? That's what you understand, like Amazon or not, they do what they do incredibly well, and they have created a brand that is synonymous with those qualities. Exactly the same for Apple, right? That they are premium quality technology, and that it is a very simple positioning that they have that is ultimately directly reflective of the audience that they're trying to target.
Yeah, and I think it does that really well. I think some of that comes through the accessibility of it. It's very obvious what they do. It's very upfront and it's very confident. I think that also runs through the tone of voice.
Coming back to what we were saying earlier, right? A brand isn't just a logo and look and feel. It is your proposition. It is your tone of voice. It is the language that you use. It is how you communicate with people, the channels that you use, the tactics you use on those channels. All of that feeds into that brand and that brand strategy. So yeah, having a very clear understanding of what you're looking to achieve, who you're looking to achieve, it enables you to be very singular in your focus. As online continues to permeate in everything, your buyers or your consumers go further and further down their journey alone, right? So 25, 30 years ago, they'd go into a shop and they'd speak to somebody about a product, or they'd ring them up and they'd speak to somebody about a product. And those touch points were more two-way conversational. Whereas now, the first sort of 18, 19 of those can be completely self-guided.
Yeah.
Before they've spoken to anybody from the brand, before they've had any interaction with that brand on a two-way level. So making sure that wherever that brand is sitting, or whatever you're communicating through that brand, that you're thinking about every single one of those touch points and how you can make them count, and how they can further your objectives and drive the narrative that you're wanting to convey. So it's not just about the website, it's not just about the logo, but it's actually about all of the different channels, touch points, everything else that the brand is interacting with, that all need to be considered and brought into the conversation.
I think it's interesting to hear how many touch points there is.
Yeah.
Because from step 1 to step 2, in each of those steps, trust is going to be the key aspect.
Yeah.
So how do we visualize that? How do we communicate that?
Again, it comes back to the brand positioning, right? Trust is always critical. Doesn't matter who you are or what you're doing, but you need to effectively be conveying those trust points as part of your proposition and a part of your positioning through all the different touch points.
And I think you make a really good point there. It's just about transparency, isn't it?
Yeah.
Being clear. Because everyone knows this goes on. Data is collected from websites. But if we're just honest and open and we say, yeah, this is what we're doing, just so you know. Again, it creates a friendly atmosphere, a friendly tone, isn't it? It's more conversational.
Yeah.
And we want brands to kind of interact with people like that. It's a conversation. It's not a dictation.
Yeah, and I think that, to go back to what we were saying kind of about the process, understanding about how you're going to build trust with your audience, how we, again, goes back to understanding your audience, to understand what they are going to buy into.
Yeah.
And making sure that the way that you approach the journey with a customer or a consumer reflects what you've learnt about them, how we build that trust based on what you know. Again, if you don't have that insight, then you don't know what is going to work and what's going to resonate.
It all comes back to insight, doesn't it? Every conversation we've had today goes full circle.
Yeah, I mean, and this is so much about kind of what we talk about every day with clients, is every decision has to be based on real intelligence, real insight, at whatever level that you're able to gather that. And that the branding process is no different. Without the right level of insight, without the right intelligence, you're just kind of throwing stones in the dark.
I think that's another really good point that you made about we're always having these conversations. I'm sure a lot of the people we work with are, but it's maybe how we then articulate that so it shines through into the website, into the collaterals, into everything we touch through our business. I think sometimes it's just bringing out that truth in what we do with branding, again, with the tone of voice, just in the visuals, the imagery.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the world changes all the time, right? And it develops and it moves on and it evolves. And I think that where brands used to be 20 years ago, or even 10, 15 years ago, isn't where they'll be in 10, 15 years' time. And transparency, trust are only going to grow in importance, not least because people have so many options. Yeah. You don't maintain customers without trust, and building a valuable brand that has value in the eyes of your audience has to be driven from that starting point of mutually beneficial.
So to put you on the spot there then, so how do we drive that value?
To reiterate the same point, it's about having that understanding of your audience that creates a proposition and a brand positioning that fundamentally has value to your audience. So to go back to the Apple example, you trust Apple because they've got good products, because they're really cool, and because they do what they say they're going to do, right? And you know that they're expensive, you know that they're overpriced, but you don't mind those because you trust in the brand that it isn't going to let you down and it isn't going to sell you something that isn't what you expected it to be.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there as well about, let's be honest, it looks really cool. We are attracted to that. But that's only built on the basis of what we've said before, foundational of the insight, of the integrity and the honesty.
You look at Microsoft. You would argue that they are just as trustworthy as Apple, but they're not cool.
They're not cool.
And there's a big distinction there.
I think that's so true, because you look at all the designers in our office, not one of them uses a PC.
No,
it is a choice.
Yeah. And just on a brand level, do you know what I mean? I think that they are incredibly advanced technology and arguably comparable with Apple in terms of kind of their positioning on the technology side, but they're not anywhere near as good on the consumer side, right? They don't understand their position, or they don't convey their positioning in any way as effectively as Apple does. So yeah, the final thing I would say, and kind of things not to forget or overlook, is your internal teams, and making sure that you bring them along for the journey, making sure that they don't feel like that's something that's been forced upon them, but actually they've been part of that journey. And
sometimes they're creating that output, the stuff that goes out into the world. Sometimes it will be done internally, and if they're not aware of brand guidelines or the new look, the new feel, it's them that's actually using it.
Yeah, but just as much as those things, which are 100% relevant, but it's the communicating of the why, right? To go back to the start of the conversation, why have we gone through this? What do we expect or hope to achieve, and how they can support those objectives. And if you don't communicate all those things, then you're just missing an opportunity to have however many hundreds or thousands of kind of brand advocates out there all on the same page.
It's such an easy win, isn't it? You've got all these people.
Yeah. And
let's maximise that message.
It gets overlooked and forgotten too often. A rebrand is a big undertaking, whether it's a revitalisation, a revamp, or a full true rebrand. It's a huge investment, time, money, energy. So you need to make sure that you're able at the end of the year to say it was a success.